Well, I think we'll begin. Just first, welcome. Good to see you all in this continued distance time, and grateful to be able to connect this way. A special thanks to Ann Hutton for, among her many hats of leadership these days, being willing and able to lead this book discussion, not only the original time, but then this reread for our forum tonight. Thank you, Anne, both for those gathered here and those who can then see it as a recording online later as well. And thanks to Amy for co-hosting tonight as well, if I have to toddle off to help with the children upstairs. Thanks, Amy. So I invite you, if you have a chalice near you or a candle or one in your mind or heart, to light one. I'll light one here in my home, and Anne will light one as I read just a brief excerpt from the book tonight, A Good Time for the Truth. And this is from the introduction, from a couple different spots that I'll string together here. So Sun Young Shin writes, so what does racial progress look like? An elimination of differences? Certainly not. We will have to co-create the future, a future not of tolerance, but a kind of pluralism that thrives because of fairness, a fairness that comes from a truth and a reconciliation process that leaves no people's stories untold. Culture is human nature. We created the culture of racism, and we can unmake it. We can transform old ways into new and better ways. We can recall old ways that worked well and bring them into the present. We have choices. We can learn and we can grow. Amen. Anne, over to you.
Okay, well, thank you, Luke. As we were just getting ready to move into this Zoom room, I had mentioned to Luke that it's like every time I pick up this book, there's a phrase that jumps out at me that I go, wow, that is just so powerful. And so thank you, Luke, for that phrase. When Luke made his announcement on Sunday about this shortened and reread of A Good Time for Truth, he mentioned the fact that we would be reading excerpts. And so I thought I would give you a heads up now that as we get close to 7:05, 7:10, if you have a favorite phrase that you've marked, or you want the next 35 minutes to find that the one favorite phrase, well, I'm going to ask people to share a reading. There's something about prose and poetry, words on the written page being spoken that seem to resonate. This time I would say, let's go for more is better, which is not more words, but more voices. So keep whatever excerpt you read to one or two sentences so that we can maybe hear from everybody. So an assignment for you before we end tonight's forum. So I wanted to sort of maybe have this as be a little bit less intense. A couple of you I know participated in the first book discussion, and we dealt with some really heavy questions. And since we have a shorter amount of time, I thought I'd start with more of a book club-like question, which is how many of you were actually familiar with one or more of these authors? So that's the first part of the question. And then as you were reading the author in this book that you already knew, how were his or hers words different than maybe a style of writing that you were already comfortable with or were already familiar with? So am I taking it from your silence that maybe all of these authors were new to you? Okay.
I'm going to plead total ignorance because I haven't read this book.
Oh, well, Sarah, I'll give you a warning. It's at least I found in everyone I've talked to, you'll be able to read a story, and you'll have to set it down. They're really that powerful.
Great.
So, I had the opportunity on several occasions to actually work with Keo Khalil Liang. She's a St. Paul resident. When I first met her, her very first book, The Late Homecoming, had just come out. And she spoke at a couple of different library conferences as a guest author. And I have to say, with that book, I read the book and I got to almost to the end of it, and I put it down. I was so engrossed in her story and the characters as she was telling her story of coming from Vietnam to Thailand to the United States. I didn't want the book to end, both just from the point of view of the book ending, but I also knew where the ending was leading us. And it was so sad. I set it aside for a month, and then I finally had to finish it. So if you have not read it, please pick it up. It's delightful. And so to answer my own question, I didn't find her essay in this one, while it was powerful, I didn't find it quite as lyrical. Her other books, I always just find they read almost like poetry, even though they're prose. And I didn't see that in necessarily in this essay. So just an opinion, since someone needs to answer the first question.
I will say that I did work with J. Ray Kim for several years when I was teaching classes to therapists on how to work with adoptees from all across the board. And she was the coordinator out of the University of Minnesota, and she was doing her PhD program. So we worked closely together for a couple of years, and she was a fun person to get to know. So that I hadn't read her writings before, but I have worked with her.
So, we're taking on this task of justice readings this month because it's Black History Month. Though actually we started this with a history of, Luke, help me out. It's a long title and I always miss like 6 of the words.
An Indigenous People's History of the United States by Roxanne Unvar-Ortiz.
Thank you. I've got the young adult title on order right now because I wanted to compare the two. So we did that in October. We did A Good Time for Truth in December and doing a reread of it for Black History Month. Why do you think it's a good time to talk about race in Minnesota? What kinds of truths do you think we've previously suppressed?
So much of it, the truth, we just haven't known. I mean, there's been such a naivety and ignorance about it, just being white and flowing through it. I'm amazed at how much I didn't know or just didn't think about. Yeah, just over my head, just because it didn't affect me. And this is the part, this book and Waking Up White I'm too old to be waking up now. I wish I would have woken up a long time ago.
I've been listening into conversations every Friday. I work at Mayo, and there's a conversation for the Diversity and Inclusion Office has been sponsoring called Everybody In. And every week the topic is slightly different, but it's a very safe space for hundreds of people from across the Mayo enterprise to listen in as a panel of invited guests discuss the topic. Last week was very raw. It was actually featured 3 Mayo employees, one from Rochester, one from Arizona, and one from Florida. talking a very, very, like I said, right in your face about personal experiences being as Mayo employees and as and members of their community, be it Scottsdale, Rochester, or Jacksonville. And then in the chat, it's a Zoom. So in the chat and the Q&A, there's just this laundry list of people commenting, asking questions, etc. That was, like I said, very raw. And if it had not been in such a, if this conversation had not been going on for many months now, and people beginning to feel this was a safe space, I don't think these things would be coming out so vividly. And it was just a moving hour for me.
Thanks, Sarah.
I'll take off on that a little bit. Maybe some of you know Julio came to our church sometimes. He was in the Nodding Wild Onions. Is that what was that their name? And he was their drummer, kind of percussionist. He was he was a Mayo employee. He very highly respected in the ophthalmology area. And he took his family. He had a great opportunity to relocate to the Arizona Mayo site. I don't remember how long they lasted, but I remember him telling about the horrific experiences that he had there, and how many times he was pulled over, and his wife is Caucasian, and one time they went to renew their driver's licenses or get their driver's licenses in Arizona. And one of the employees of the DMV pulled her over and said, "Are you okay? Are you safe? And is there anything I can do to help you?" Just based strictly on the fact that they were a biracial couple together in that setting. So in that respect, I am just saying that was a positive for Minnesota. They didn't experience that in Rochester, at least. But reading the book, I totally agree with Anne, and I was part of the discussion before. I could only read one chapter, one section a day, and then I had to put it down sometimes for more than one day because it was so heart-wrenching and horrible.
I think that, we have had the luxury of sort of hiding behind that expression, Minnesota nice, and being proud that we were Minnesota nice. And, so many times people are nice. And so reading that book, it was shocking to me, just the extent of the prejudice and the hatred that people experienced across, it's across the state, but particularly the Twin Cities. And, the fact that our Minneapolis police force had that horrible reputation even before George Floyd, that was shocking to me. And I think that the George Floyd incident has just brought this whole truth about the way things really are crashing down on us. And we have got to face it and, do something about it if we want to move forward. So.
I really agree with that. I really like the, I can't remember which one it is now, but the woman who had thought about going to grad school in the South, and then she came to Minnesota and she had been in the South and saw all these Confederate flags and like, well, we don't, we have a lot fewer Confederate flags up here, but like that hides the same mentality. It's just, it's the Confederate flag hidden. We're not less racist because there are fewer flags here than in the South.
Well, they certainly popped up recently in the last 4 years here.
Oh, that's my neighbor has been flying them, so That's
Really? When we were sometimes at Hawthorne for Hawthorne Education Center, there was a infamous pickup truck that would get great joy of coming through the parking lot on a regular basis and parking in front of the door and intimidating the students. So they had more chance maybe recently to come out of the woodwork.
I was going to agree with what Molly said there about, I think it's Tian Coleman who wrote about that, of that phrase that at least in the South, I knew where people stood. Like it was more clear what values they held. Here it's hidden. And I think that's true. And there are those pockets where it is, I mean, growing up in Mankato, going to high school in not that long ago, I won't make myself seem too young, but not that long ago in Mankato, there was, truck row, we called it, in the back of the parking lot, where all these big pickup trucks, and fairly regularly, a couple of them would have Confederate flags. So that's, a couple hours from here, not many years ago. And growing up in a moderate household like I did, didn't think a whole lot of it other than like, that's weird and probably wrong. But it was so just kind of live and let live sort of perspective, that it was all neutral, kind of amoral perspectives on freedom of speech and all that sort of stuff. So how prevalent it is and how unquestioned it is, even among people who are moderately progressive and open-minded. It's wild.
I remember about 35 years ago, I was not living here. I was in Spring Valley and had young children. And our church sponsored a family from Vietnam. And I was very much a part of that. And we got them all set up in a home, and donations poured in. And so I was struck by the story, how true, and it just really hit me though, how true these words were. And I can't remember which one. I read the book several months ago, that after a certain point, then the involvement just dropped down. Like if they hadn't achieved it in that first year, or against all odds, but if they hadn't achieved it in the first year or year and a half or two, well, then it was sort of like, well, I don't know what's wrong with you guys. I mean, I wasn't feeling that, but that's basically how it was playing out for them too. So that struck me when I read that story. How we're Minnesota nice until we're not.
I know that TPT has a series that they're either re-airing this month, or they have a number of new productions that they're airing this month because of Black History Month, that they're looking at in more depth at Minnesota history and the topic of race, and things that we, as a person who's only been here for 34 years, I didn't realize that there were lynchings in Duluth. I think about Duluth as breweries and rose gardens, and the walk along the out to the lift bridge. I don't think about that and the ugliness of some of the things that have happened in the past, which then of course colors who we are today as well, sort of whether it's pickup trucks in the high school parking lot, or pickup trucks at the school building and intimidating people at Hawthorne helps. The authors shared their vulnerability, how we've had a little bit of touching on how this book was people responded emotionally. For those who have had a chance to read the book, were there stories that you identified with more closely, or that you had experiences that were sort of like revelations, that you were like, oh my goodness, I never envisioned that?
Growing up in Minnesota, there was no diversity. And I didn't really I mean, yeah, we're all very nice, but we all look alike. And we brought a very talented math teacher to Pacelli in Austin, who was Black, had a young family, new baby. And I was going to the public school by that time. I transferred over and was getting a lot of harassment from my algebra teacher, who, he catered to the boys' football. That's what he coached. And my mom lined me up with this math instructor at Pacelli as a tutor, which made it every day was harass about that. I mean, and to the point where I had to get out of that class. And that teacher was eventually run out of town, literally. So, I mean, we're all very nice, but we're not very good. As long as there is no differences, then there's no issue, right? And it wasn't until, was it the late 70s, that we started seeing more diverse populations in this area, especially after the Vietnam War, when we brought a lot of Vietnamese. And we've had to, we have had really a hard time figuring it out, unfortunately. I think as a community, it's been pretty shameful, but we don't really have a history. I don't have in my childhood, other than, being taught it was always wrong. My mother grew up in the South, and we did visit her family, and segregation was going on then. And I just thought that was the most horrible thing. And so did she, I mean, that's why she didn't ever care to go back there. But our experiences, and then we look back at them later and go, oh, that's what that was. Mm-hmm. But I didn't really even realize how much people in the community actually, I mean, we had Ku Klux Klan here, and I mean, not that many years ago. Klan rallies. So, but I didn't realize that we weren't really nice until I was older.
When I was a kid living in Austin, I remember the adults sitting around talking about how, nobody was prejudiced. Everybody was very open-minded. And it was only later, as I became an adult, that it dawned on me, well, sure, they weren't prejudiced, but there weren't anybody but white people around for miles. So it was never tested, I think, like Dottie is saying. And when it did get tested, it turned out that there was a lot of prejudice in the town, which was a shame, certainly. I had an experience as a young deputy sheriff out in the San Diego area. And unlike Reverend Luke, this is a long time ago. But I worked in a primarily suburban area that was and still is overwhelmingly Caucasian. And one night I pulled over a vehicle for a minor traffic situation of some kind. It was dark, I couldn't see the driver. When I walked up to the vehicle, there was a rather distinguished looking Black man there. And I almost swear there was steam coming out of his ears. He was convinced I pulled him over because he was a black man driving a Cadillac. We had a short, tense conversation, but I quietly explained why I pulled him over and cut him loose. Under the circumstances, it did seem a good idea to write a ticket for a minor violation, but I had been told about race relations with people of color and white police officers, but it just hadn't been a personal experience before that. But it was an eye opener.
One thing I was struck with, and I think this was in the introduction, similar to some of what's been shared here, is the difference between the North and the South and kind of the assumed moral superiority that often happens in the North, that we don't have the history of slavery in the same way here. We are on the right side of the Civil War, all that sort of stuff. And the difference between having race be part of your regular culture that you're forced to interact with in the South in a different way, regardless of kind of where you come down on it. You're having to engage it in some real lived way, where in the North, by and large, it tends to be quiet and segmented. So that idea of we're Minnesota nice, but it's surface level. We don't talk about how we maybe have these histories of discrimination. I mean, in Mankato, while we did learn about the mass hanging of Native Americans, the Dakota 38 in elementary school, I think that was a fairly recent development. For many years, that really was also ignored. And even during, my time, it wasn't highlighted a whole lot, but just said, here's a thing that happened, that was bad, moving on. So how we kind of gloss over things and how the being on the right side of the Civil War has perpetuated that in a lot of ways in our psyche, in our cultural Northern psyche, and how to untangle that is complicated.
We were surprised to learn, we went to some history center presentations where a lawyer from the cities had written a book on research he'd done on slavery in Minnesota. The book is called Black Dakota, and it was actually about a slave. Apparently at Snelling, there were a lot of slaves that military people coming from the South would bring their slaves with them. And this guy ended up joining a Dakota tribe because that's where he was accepted. But was he ever freed? His mother was freed, but I don't think he was.
I don't remember.
It's a fascinating story, but no.
It was
I did not
interesting.
know we had slavery in Minnesota until.
It was interesting. The author looked at us at one point and said, there was no Minnesota nice version of slavery. It was pretty much as bad as it had been everywhere else. It was an eye opener, but it was sobering to learn these things.
Yeah, luckily Minnesota decided against bringing slavery to Minnesota, but.
That's a good point. This was happening when Minnesota was still a territory. When it became a state, it ended, I believe.
Yeah.
Trying to skim the chapter on the good kind of immigrants by J. Ran Kim. A while since I read it, but that was kind of eye-opening for me. Was she considered her adoption like the first? I can't remember what the phrase was that she used. Maybe somebody else will. The first assault, or the first really difficult thing that she had to deal with. And she talks about just adoption in general, the way it was practiced as nation building, where she says it's a project of nation building at two levels: the intimate sphere of private family building and the public national level aims of growing a robust citizenry. And, how difficult that was for her growing up in a white family with no interest in her Korean heritage. And it's like she's never forgiven her adoptive parents for that. And I know Minnesota has, for a while anyway, we were leading the country in Korean adoptions. And we have several people in our church who've adopted Korean children. That was just so hard to read that, so many of these children feel like, how much they'd lost and what a difficult thing that was. So for me, that was one of the most eye-opening chapters.
Well, in that chapter also, they refer to the taking of, the idea that you're going to make this child into the right American, and the whole terrible history that we have also, where I try to think about this, and I'm not even a parent, but I'm thinking about, taking a child away from his or her parents and putting them in, what they called Indian schools to make them proper Americans. It's just such a horrific thing. And Richard and I were traveling out to the West Coast a few years ago, and we actually visited one of these institutions that is now on the North Dakota Historic Register, and it was still being used as an Indian school into the 60s. And I'm thinking, I'm of an age that had I not been white privilege living in Wisconsin, I could have been one of those children, because I'm of an age that they were still taking children from their mothers to put them in school when I was in kindergarten. So yeah, our history throughout the United States is less than a proud one. Well, I did promise people a chance to read a phrase. Robin, or anyone else that's had a chance to read the book, do you want to share something?
I need longer. I need longer.
Before we go there, Molly, did you have your hand up and I just didn't see it?
Yeah, I was just going to say, just quickly, one of the things that really stood out to me just as I read a lot of these is the way that, like, so often these authors are just going about their life. They're at a bar dancing, they're, watching a football game at the bar or whatever. And then, like, something happens and all of a sudden, like, it's awful, right? It just totally, they're all of a sudden their heart's racing and they're stressed out, and it's just strikes me as being so hard, and so, like, bad for you physically and emotionally, to just, like, at any random time something like this can happen to you, this racist incident or whatever, and it just must be exhausting.
They never know when they'll step on a landmine or run into a person that, even if you walk through Rochester and I do eye contact with people. Well, with the masks, it's another whole thing, but I'll do eye contact, but with people of color, you will notice that most of them are looking down because they don't know when that they're going to step on that landmine. They just, they don't know.
And I think,
go ahead.
Yeah, no, and I think, like, as a white person, like, I think I feel sometimes like people of color don't necessarily, like, they don't automatically just trust white people, and, like, that's why, and they can't because they're trying to protect themselves a little bit. And so I think that's part of being privileged, is just accepting, like, we're not always going to be trust, like, people are going to look at us with mistrust, and that's just part of it, because that's how they're surviving.
The editor has a phrase, and I actually had it. One of those was one of that I was going to share. Most people of color in the United States have to think about race every day, multiple times a day. We are constantly negotiating our bodies, ourselves, our identities. So it speaks to Molly's comment about the fact that it's constant. It's, you know, it's like being scared in a horror movie. But you know, when I'm watching TV, I get to choose what I watch and when I'm going to be scared. And it's infrequent. It's not every day.
The
One of
passage that I
one of
chose to share. Oh, should I go? Okay, the little passage that I chose to share is from Sherry Kwan Lee, her chapter, The Discomfort Zone. And she says, I'm a recovering Black Chinese woman who grew up passing for white. Some days are easier than others, but some days I feel the weight of living a lie, not purposely, but passing in and out of boundaries that will always segregate all of who I am. I thought that kind of echoed what you were both talking about.
Mhm. In the chapter by the young Peruvian person who came in the 4th grade to Minnesota, the title of that chapter was Fighting the Oppressive Whiteness, and his comment about finding so much racism and always fighting for our right to exist. I have 2 adopted Peruvian, a niece and a nephew, and I know that they have felt that way themselves too. And the other piece, there were so many, but I wanted to mention the Japanese gentleman whose parents were imprisoned during World War II.
Yeah.
A surrealist history of one Asian American in Minnesota. And he talked about that he has written so many books and won so many national awards for his books, but he's never won a Minnesota Book Award. And how really sad that is. And he was very involved in the demonstrations and picketing when Miss Saigon played at the Ordway. I don't know if any of you saw that. I went to it and I saw the pickets outside, and I read the articles, and I was working during that time. I was working with Vietnamese, Hmong, and Lao immigrants, and after I got in there and sat down and was in the middle of that musical, I just felt so horrible, and I just wanted to leave and not even finish seeing the rest of it. It's so, it's so hard to recognize and realize what pieces and things that we do in our life that are harmful to others,
Anyone else have something they want to read? I've got one then. This one is by Heidi Erdrich, and it hit me that it explained so much.
That's good. Yeah.
Thinking about, and looking at the world with a 21st century perspective, it's like, how could anyone think owning slaves was right? How could this kind of oppression been allowed? But her sentence reads, in Europe, rulers owned almost everything. When Europeans came here, they found indigenous people who lived in relationship to place, who belonged to the land rather than the land belonging to them. This was the land of opportunity for newcomers. Here, anyone, not just the royalty, could take ownership. If you could own land, you could own people. The concept simply extends. If you can make a country out of ownership, you can carry weapons to protect what you own, and you can stand your own ground. And those couple of sentences sort of like put everything in perspective as I sort of look at things and say, how can this still be going on? And it's so ingrained into our national psyche, going all the way back to 1620 and stepping on a rock in Plymouth. So we're getting close to our time tonight. I know that a number of people have others church Zoom meetings to go to, Luke included. So anything that you want to share as we wrap tonight up?
I'd recommend Kent Kruger's latest book. Have you read that, Anne? This Tender Land. It's a
yes.
Yeah, about the Native American children being taken from their families.
He's got a new O'Connor mystery, and I just mounted a presentation with him, so I was thinking mystery books, not that one. I'll put in another book plug for The Late Homecomer. Again, it is just an absolutely amazing book. The first time I read it, I thought, everyone who is in elected office should have to read this book as part of orientation, and continue to read it as they go through their office, because it's like you can't read this book and then feel as if we should not be doing more for the immigrants. They do so much, they go through so much just to get here. Once they're here, we should not be treating them so poorly. But just another really good book. Thank you all. This evening's session is being recorded, so if there's someone you know that has missed the discussion, you can direct them to the website. And a special thanks to those of you who are always working on the front lines and behind the scenes as we try to live our values, our UU values, and work towards justice. So thank you to those of you who are trying to live and make this world that we live in a better place. Luke, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Anne, for leading. Thanks for the discussion this evening, everyone. Just a reminder, we hope you join us next week for the Building Our Future Forum Wednesday night or the following Sunday. And then if you're interested, the next common read is Just Mercy. That'll be on, Anne's got it there, by Brian Stevenson, Monday, February 22nd at 6:30. And you can find the link for that in your e-news that came out today if you want to join that as well. So the conversation continues online for now and in person eventually. And wishing you all well. Thanks for being here tonight. Take care. Bye-bye.